Hello. Uh, I'm not sure what went awry. I have a normal manner by which I get on my Zoom, and I had zero participants. It scared the heck out of me. So I got some help from my wife, and all is well. I see 21 participants. That's wonderful. All right. So as I am writing this down, are there any questions or comments? Go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a quick question, Professor. Are you planning to grade the first writing assignment so that way we kind of have a good understanding if we're actually providing the right material that you're looking for?
Sure, absolutely. I'll be happy to do that in the next couple days.
Okay, great. That way I know that I'm understanding and for the second one.
Exactly. No, I understand. And no, I'll be happy to do that very soon. All right.
I have another question
Sure.
for our required books. Is
Yes.
it possible for you to list it in our bookstore?
You know what? I tried that today. I'm awaiting their response. But hopefully,
Okay.
hopefully all will go well with that, and I will be. Yeah, I'm actually trying that right now.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, that was my fault, not signing up with the bookstore to begin with. And so it's not their fault if it at this late of a juncture they won't allow it, but I could sure as heck give it a try. I had a student ask me for that, and so I was doing it for her. So absolutely. Sorry, I'm trying to get everyone's name down. Anybody else? Anyone else at all?
There's a question in the chat room.
Yeah, what would that be? I'm sorry.
Somebody asked, I see that there are unlimited attempts on the assignments. If we don't like our score on a specific assignment, can we try it again for a regrade?
You know what? I haven't done that just because it literally hasn't even occurred to me to do that. And I've never had a student ask that. Let me think about that, okay? Because I'm amenable to that idea. Yeah, let me think on that because it does offer unlimited anyway, right? But I had not yet thought of doing that for someone whose assignment I had already graded. So yeah, I'll tell you what, I'll get back to you on that question by way of an announcement. Okay, no problem. No problem at all. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. To be honest, I probably will be okay with that because you're doing the extra work to try to turn it in and do a better job on it. I think my only consideration is just the can of worms that could open as far as getting down to the end of the year. I may have to put a stipulation on it or two. But yeah, let me chew on that if you don't mind, and we'll see what we can do. Okay, I believe I have everyone's name. So what I want to do now is I want to share the screen. All right. And just give you like a brief chronology of Spanish colonization. Now, when you do this assignment, right, note that, or I'll tell you what, with the themes, I'm going to go back and forth with these two, okay? I mean, as you see this one, 66 slides, that's ridiculous. And I apologize for having so much material. There's just so much on this material. But you see there a map of Spanish Americas from the 1500s up into the 1820s. And yeah, so support for the Black legend. It's evidence for the Spanish being excessively religiously fanatical, evidence for exploitation and brutality of Native Americans in particular, and depicting the Spanish Americas as inequitable, as unfair, imbalanced, right? Oligarchic, with a few people ruling at the expense of everybody else, in kind of parasitical fashion. Then revising the Black legend. Some say, you know what, they don't take in mind the context, the surrounding context. Other people say that depicting the Native Americans as innocent victims is condescending and inaccurate. And then some say that it doesn't keep in mind the fact that there was some fluidity and accountability in Spanish America. So the Black legend, right? Why something bad has to be black is a whole other can of worms that we'll get into soon with slavery. But notice that here, that with the Spanish Americas, is the Spaniards were depicted by Dutch and English chroniclers and jurists and writers, etc., of the early modern era of the 1600s, as just this, as being religious zealots, brutal, exploitative, archaic or backward, right? And so all those negative descriptions were ascribed to them. And so the Spaniards, in return, one particular gentleman said, this is all a black legend. It's all a big, black, dark lie about us by our enemies, because of course they want to conquer the Americas and try to depict their version of colonization as a lesser evil. So that is something to keep in mind. So when I use the term black legend, that's what we're referring to, is we're referring to the use of the Spanish as an ideal anti-model for today, how we don't want to be today. So if they were religiously intolerant, right, we want to be tolerant and diverse, right, here in today's context. If they were, if they were brutal, of course, we want to teach pacifism, okay, and if not outright pacifism to the full extent, at least, anti-violent rhetoric, of course. And then today, right, we're for egalitarianism, everyone being on an equal footing. And with the Spanish, we contend, right, those who adhere to the Black legend, that the Spanish provided anything but a society that was egalitarian. So hence, we could ironically learn from the Spanish by how wrong they were on all these fronts, and teach them as a useful anti-model today. All right, so keep that in mind when you look over the assignment, is that's what we're doing with the first assignment, right? Let me see here if I have to pull it up or if I have it already. So with the Black legend assignment, see here, the first one, you're saying, well, look at the context. So number one, you're revising the Black legend and you're saying, that's not really fair to make a villain out of Christopher Columbus. Look at the world that he came from. Look at the circumstances that he was trying to extricate himself from. And so there a lot of, like I said, I put together number one with tongue in cheek, right? With a smile on my face thinking, I don't necessarily believe this myself, but I'm going to throw it forward anyway, because I thought it was thought-provoking by David Boyle to defend Columbus to such an extent. And basically saying, right, that the poor guy had his back to the wall, that if he wanted to extricate himself and his family from poverty, he had to play the game, and playing the game until doing whatever the merchants wanted him to do, because he was playing with other people's money. All right, so keep that in mind. And then number two, again, look for revisionist history of the Black legend, where it's saying, well, we shouldn't be so hard on the Spanish. Absolutely, by today's standards, the Spanish were very religiously fanatical and intolerant. But you got to consider the world that they lived in. That's what the world was like at the time. And it's unfair to put our contemporary vantage point and worldview and put it on to the 16th and 17th century Spaniards. That's not fair to do that. So again, you're looking at revisionist history of the Black legend on numbers 1 and 2. And feel free to tear into these theses, okay, these arguments. Like I said, I put some of them together thinking to myself, you know what, I don't personally believe what I'm writing, but I thought it was interesting from a professor that I've sat under or a book that I've read. And I thought that it was thought provoking, so I'm going to go with it. All right. And then, of course, number 3, look for adherence to the Black legend, saying, you know what, by most accounts, as an egalitarian society, at least in our rhetoric today, absolutely Spain was archaic and inequitable. And here's the reason why. And then I try to support that negative image of Spanish America as being very, very inequitable or unfair, imbalanced, oligarchic. All right. So number 3, look for, adherence to the Black legend and showing how unfair Spanish society was. And then number 4 is good old deflection, right? And saying, okay, the Spanish were pretty inequitable, the society in which they created by today's standards. But let's look at the same time, their contemporaries in English Virginia. And were the English any better? So just deflecting the blame, right, and the criticism to the English, because after all, the Black legend, right, entails a belief that the Spanish were a bit uniquely brutal and overly zealous and intolerant and inequitable, right, compared even to others of its same time period. That's part of the Black legend. So with number 4 is trying to defend the Spanish, saying, well, I don't think the English were any better. Look how inequitable English Virginia was in its colonial time period. All right. So please read all 4 of them. And please take a look at the first questions of the test that I should have put up by now on Canvas. So you could take a look at what's coming, okay, after your first 4 subjects, and look at the questions that pertain to Spanish America and what you need to know. Most of the material that you need for the test can be found in these argumentative assignments. So for sure, read all 4, but then just choose one. And it's not too different, really. It's hard for myself to even distinguish it much from a summary. You're just giving me what the main idea was, an example or 2 of how that main idea was conveyed. And then you're telling me why you do or do not hold, in your private estimation, that section's argument to be fair and credible. Okay. So that's what you're doing with your choice of number 1, 2, 3, or 4. All right. So before I give a little bit more context to this topic, any questions, any other questions you guys have? All right. So, a basic chronology is, let's see here. I have these in my own mind. I had a reason for the order of these slides, but right now it's not striking me very well. So I'm gonna bounce around a little bit. So notice in the first slide here on slide 14, the first voyage of 1492, right? They went into the Bahamas and they claimed an island. They named it San Salvador. They said
Sorry
the
to
name.
interrupt, Professor, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but your slides are not showing. It's frozen on the very first slide of the PowerPoint.
Oh no. Okay. All right.
I didn't want to be a bother. I was about to say the same thing as well.
No, please, you're not bothering at all. I invite the same thing in class. I have no problem with someone stopping me with something, especially something vital like that. So I'm going to put a note for myself, as I just did. I'll take that PowerPoint off and try it again and put it back on. And just if you would, as it's obviously going to happen after this Zoom meeting, if someone could please let me know by way of a Canvas message, if it worked or not. Okay, I'd greatly appreciate that. But like I said, I'll take it off and try to put it back on and see what happens. I hope it has nothing to do with the length because if it does, I'll greatly curtail it. And also I could put up this other one that I have that's only about 7 slides.
Also,
All right, so-
are you
Yeah.
able to post like this PowerPoint in the modules as well?
Yes, I on my end, I already have done so.
Oh, you have, okay, because I only
Yeah.
saw one of the PowerPoints. Okay.
Yeah, this was the one, this really long one was the one on my side, at least I posted already. But yeah, if it's frozen on the first slide, I can't help but wonder if it's because of the length. That is 66 slides are quite a few. So I may just greatly curtail it and give you guys like a truncated version of it. All right, so yeah, thank you for, but don't ever apologize for intervening and letting me know that, okay? Anything like that at any time, I welcome it. So now I know, so I'll do my best to do something about that, for sure. All right. And so he claims that the natives were okay with it, without contradiction, he said. And then he offers a search for gold. And then he builds a fort, Fort Navidad, and he makes a treaty with Guerino and against the Caribs that the Caribbean's named after, who were a hated and feared cannibalistic tribe in the Caribbean. He makes a treaty with the Arawak tribe. So at any rate, he has a horrible letter where he writes to King Ferdinand. And you could find this in Major Problems in American History, a basic text that is filled with primary sources. Remember, primary source comes from that time period. So you have a letter to King Ferdinand or Columbus's letter to King Ferdinand. You could Google it. It's not too long. And then also I have, boy, my Spanish is rusty. I'm not trying to show off, but I also a long time ago studied Spanish, and I have a Spanish literature book. And it's Hispanic American literature in Spanish. And it's incredible. It has primary sources from Columbus, from Cortez, from Las Casas, from Castillo, and these other men that I'm going to mention today for my Spanish readers. So at any rate, does someone have a question? Oh, okay. So in that letter, it just sounds awful. It's very difficult to contend, even knowing the context. He says basically he brags about the natural resources of the Bahamas, how beautiful they are and how rich in resources. And he tells King Ferdinand, or he basically asks him, he says, what would you like? Whatever you'd like, I offer it to you. If you want slaves, I'll bring back slaves. How many do you want? You want this or that? I have my men looking for gold, etc. It sounds very, very utilitarian, right? That he is manipulatively looking at these islands in a manner by which he can personally enrich himself and enrich his benefactors at the expense, including at the expense of the Native Americans. And he says oftentimes, he says that they're incredulously timidos, timid or timorous. And he says, with 50 men, we could subdue this entire island. Just say the word. So like I said, it's hard to defend that letter to Ferdinand. It really is. But you got to recall also that he owes King Ferdinand. King Ferdinand was skeptical of helping to fund his expedition to begin with. And he was supposed to bring back some type of profit and not just pay the money invested in him back, but to yield a profit in return by way of some commodity. And this was happening in Indonesia and in the quote Indies for the entire 1500s, even before that, by way of Venetian and other Italians and the Portuguese and later the Dutch and others coming into the Indonesian islands and taking over, Java, Mocha, all these small islands and trying to cultivate coffee. And they would fight with one another. A guy named Andre Gunder Frank, Frank, has a book called Reorient, and it gives all the juicy details of the fighting, literal fighting and commercial jostling of these different European powers, along with the Eastern powers, over commodities that were making a lot of money back in Europe. And so at any rate, he owed his creditors money and was trying to offer just that, whatever they liked in return. But when he comes back on the second trip, that's when he is allowed, he's given permission from the Catholic Church and from Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile and Aragon, Spain, to colonize the Americas, right? And notice here it says also convert to our holy Catholic faith. Pope Alexander VI happened to be at this same time a Spaniard, and he was the Pope of the Catholic Church. And he gave what were known as the Alexandrine Papal Bulls, B-U-L-L-S. And in these papal bulls, he gave a mandate to Spanish Catholics in particular, and Portuguese Catholics, that they had his blessing to conquer pagan lands, provided that they convert the souls of those therein, in those lands. So wow, right? I mean, we would definitely call that ethnocentric, right? Putting your culture, your ethnicity, your worldview at the center of the universe, and having everything revolve around that in a very, just in a very arrogant way of hubris, right? Of cockiness and arrogance and so forth. So at any rate, they were allowed to set up a government and a trade system, have the Columbia Exchange began at that point, and plants and animals and ideas and so forth being exchanged between the Americans and the Spaniards here in the Caribbean. So at any rate, when he comes back on the second one, his 50 men had been killed, and he wanted to know why. And Chief Cannibal was hiding, and he had a gun wound to his thigh. And he contended, he made up something that supposedly caught himself in a lie. And so Columbus blamed Cannibal and the Arawaks underneath him for violating their military agreement and their alliance and killing his Spanish men. And then supposedly what came out was that the Spanish men were raping the Arawak women. And so the Arawak men resorted to a punitive response. So at any rate, he sent what he called punitive expeditions to punish and make a lesson to the Native Americans. And you're going to find that common amongst the Spaniards, although Columbus obviously was an Italian, Genoese, who was a mercenary for Spain. But at any rate, amongst the Spaniards, and I don't mean that in any kind of essentialist way about Spaniards. I mean it about the Spanish Empire and its hierarchy, its culture. It is what it is for whatever reason. Many times they were a bit Machiavellian in what they would do, right? Kind of manipulative and desiring to be feared more than loved. Is they would contend that being outnumbered so greatly by the Native Americans, they needed to scare them into submission. They needed to do something to scare them for their own safety, for the Spaniards' safety, so lest the Native Americans rise up against them. So at any rate, then he has men go off on their own and engage in mutiny. He catches them, has them publicly executed before the rest of his men, gives threats of death to those who take off and leave. Despite such threats and such public punishment, severe punishment, some of his men escaped to present-day Puerto Rico, where the Taino tribe was, and they were looking for gold, and they found some. And they quickly gained conflict with the Taino there, and there were a couple other factors that went into it, and they ended up going to war with the Taino. And remember, the very first thing they did was catch an alliance against the Caribs. So now, within a year, the Spaniards of them landing in the Caribbean, they were at war with all three of the major tribes of the Caribbean. First, the Caribs, then the Arawak through the Fort Navidad episode, and then the Taino, largely tied to the gold fields of Puerto Rico. And so it was a mess. and Columbus is going to be put under a juez de residencia, and a juez de residencia, Juez, and then de, and then residencia. He was put under house arrest, had a judge investigate any accusations against him for abuses of power or nepotism or anything corrupt. And then he was found guilty and arrested and brought back in chains back to Spain. And so that was their system. One of their systems of accountability was that house arrest system. So at any rate, you have that happening. While he's there, or just the next generation, the son of the scribe who was sent with him was Bartolome de las Casas, right? The houses, right? LAS and then CASAS. Las Casas, he wrote a book that is translated as a brief history of the destruction of the Indies, because they called the Caribbean the Indies, thinking that they were in Indonesian, supposedly, at first. And at any rate, it's just incredible, just the story after story he gives, a detail of the brutality that the Spaniards subjected the Native Americans of the Caribbean to, such as hanging them so that their feet were just about a foot from touching the ground, almost teasingly, making bets as to who could slice someone in two, pulling babies from their mother's arms and dashing the babies' heads against the rocks and throwing the babies into the river. Just awful, awful stuff, according to Bartolome de las Casas, whose father had been a scribe originally sent with Columbus to keep a record of things. And so at any rate, just some ugly stuff. Then another big year was 1502. So his 4 voyages happened from 1492 to 1497, roughly. And in 1502, a guy named Nicolas de Ovando, Ovando, initiated the first federal bureaucracy, if you will, of Spanish America. And let me see here. It's so much more concise in this smaller one. Let's see here. It's aligned with this right here. So the Spanish hierarchy, okay? What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to duplicate this slide, and I'm going to write out the Spanish hierarchy on this one. And then we'll go to pigmentocracy and so forth in the next slide. So at the top, for instance, right, you had, by virtue of the patronato, royal patronage given to the king, Queen Isabella of Castile, and Ferdinand of Aragon, is you had the royal patronage over the church, right? Power over secular and clerical powers, right? The king and queen, because they united, by the way, Ferdinand and Isabella, because Spain wasn't one yet. And it wasn't one, no, I don't mean W-O-N, but one-O-N-E. It wasn't one united yet. So, so king and queen. Then underneath them was the Royal Council of the Indies. And the Council of the Indies had to adhere to the Constitution of Castile, the more powerful of the two. Queen Isabella was arguably more powerful than King Ferdinand. And they were both contesting for their own thrones back at home. So they had a sense of precariousness to their own authority. But nevertheless, on paper, it looked like they had near absolute power. So the Council of Indies comprised about 5 individuals who were handpicked by the crown. They could write a constitution for the Americas, but it had to adhere to the Constitution of Castile, and it was subject to the royal veto power of Ferdinand and Isabella. Then beneath them, they would send a virrey, a vice king, a viceroy. that person had complete police powers and executive powers to enforce the laws of the land in the Americas. So under certain circumstances, literally the viceroy had power of life and death in his hands. I say his because it was always a man. Let's see here. Then after the viceroy, you had the audiencia. And the audiencia were the court system, the judges, the oidores or judges. All right. They were handpicked, Spaniards as well. And they had a lot of power in their hands to adjudicate disputes and to look over the violations of civil and criminal law. All right. Then you had governors, gobernadores, right? And the governors were pretty similar to the position of governor today, a regional chief executive. Then you had the corregidores, and like the verb corregir, to correct in Spanish, right? They came and they had power of vetoing local laws and demanding taxes and tribute. And when I mean tribute, they could the tribute that they could form was the encomienda, or I'm sorry, the repartimiento. And that's when certain number of Native Americans from each village or area had to be used, volunteered to either fight in the army or to build a road or a church or help build infrastructure and engage in some type of public work. So the corregidores were hated, right? There's a lot of evidence of resentment toward them, some of them even getting murdered, etc. And then you had city councils at the local level, cabildos. And so, and city councils and alcaldes mayores, so hence where we get the term mayors. All right, so a very strict hierarchy you see here, and it was established under Nicolas de Ovando in the Caribbean on the island of Dominican Republic and Haiti, which the Spaniards named Española. All right. This was, let me make a note, this was briefly interrupted by the conquerors, like Hernando Cortez. This system. So this was established in 1502 in the Caribbean, all right? But then in 1519 into 1521, Hernando Cortez conquered Mexico and the mighty Mexica or Aztec Empire. And in doing so, Las Casas, the same historian, right? He contends that what they did was awful. For instance, just outside the capital of Tenochtitlan, he says that right here, right? If my Spanish is any good, in order to put and to sow fear of them and of their courage in all the corners of the world. So in order to strike fear and show how brave they were, right? And to intimidate, basically, and even you might even go so far as say to terrorize the Native Americans in Mexico. They massacred Cholulans that were in the middle of a dance, supposedly honoring them as their guests. Then with Moctezuma II, he invites them in and they put him under house arrest. They pilfer from his treasury and take from his stuff. Then when the people rise up against them, they hold him as hostage. And when that fails to work, supposedly Cortez and his men kill Moctezuma before the very crowd on the roof of his own palace, according to Las Casas' account. And Las Casas, right? I'm working on my Spanish here, but he says here in this Spanish literature book, bear with me here. on page 1 of this Spanish literature book. And from the year 1518 to the day of today that we're in, 1542, when he wrote it, he said, they have overflowed the cup of God's wrath with their iniquity, their injustice, their violence, their tyranny. I mean, those who call themselves Christians, and what they've done to the Indians. Because from everything, they've lost all fear of God. They've lost all fear of their own Spanish king. And they've even forgotten themselves. Because from all of this, from all of their, I don't know that word, and cruelties and their massacres and destructions and all of the depopulation that they've brought about, and violence and tyranny and all of that, and the grand tierra firme is the land of, as opposed to the Caribbean, the Mexico, right? The North American continent. Everything that they've done, there is nothing that can be compared in the history of man as to the awful that they have done. And that's literally just page 1 from Las Casas' brief history of the destruction of the Indies. And he calls the Native Americans meek sheep, ovejas mansas. And he says that the Spaniards came in like tigers and lions looking for whom they could devour, and wolves to try to devour the sheep. And so he himself was a Spanish intellectual like his father, had a system was enacted that invited this brutality, arguably, and it was known as the encomienda. See, they were doing this back in Spain, is they were ruled at one region to the next differed, and different generations differed. It wasn't a monolithic story by any means, but by and large, they were ruled by a Muslim caliphate from 711 to 1492, beginning with a guy named Ibn al-Tariq from North Africa. And so in Cordoba, Spain, the Muslims called it Al-Andalus, where we get the term Andalusia in southern Spain. And they imposed, a Muslim law. But a few of them, like a guy named Ibn al-Ramad III, were very tolerant of the Spanish Catholics, and then some were not. And so at any rate, they were fighting what they declared in the Catholic Church sanctioned as a holy war against these Moors, these North African Arabic Muslims and Berber Muslims. And so at any rate, they were encouraged and told that if they fought and died in battle, that would be a great merit to their soul as far as their idea of salvation after death. And that also they could be entitled, if they should fight and prevail, to the forced the forced labor of those that they vanquish. And it was called the encomienda. It was awful. All right, the encomienda. So at any rate, with that system open, he received himself, Las Casas, an encomienda. And supposedly he sat under a priest named Montesinos in the Caribbean. And Montesinos said the way the Spaniards are treating the Native Americans constitutes a mortal sin, that if they don't repent of it, they're going to go to hell for it and be punished severely by God in the afterlife. So he repents, he gives up his enslaved Native Americans, his encomienda, and he joins the Catholic clergy. And shame on me, I should remember, but he became either a friar or a priest. And then he wrote these histories saying how awful his fellow Spaniards were to the Native Americans, and created that dichotomy of meek sheep Native Americans and very shrewd, manipulative, and brutal Spaniards who called themselves Christians, he said, right, and Catholics. So at any rate, that is Las Casas's take. And then when you get into U.S. history, the history of the U.S., let's see here, you have these regional entrances, entradas, right? So in 1511, 1528, and 1565, They went into present day Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas. I can't see that, but I should know off memory. So 1511, Ponce de Leon, 1528, Pedro de Narvaez, and 1565, a guy named Menendez de Avila. In 1540, they went up into Upper California as opposed to Lower Cal or Baja California, and also Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Tennessee. And then I'm assuming that's North Carolina. Because it's two persons, or three people actually. Cabrillo came up California. You don't need to know these names. Vasquez de Coronado went into the Southwest, up into the Midwest. And then Hernando de Soto went up into the Deep South in the Mississippi River, all the way up to perhaps Tennessee. So at any rate, you have those entrances into the U.S. Spanish Florida was established in the 1560s, Upper California in the Southwest by the 1540s, Mississippi Valley by 1540. Then to really colonize, though, began in New Mexico in 1599 under Don Juan de Oñate in New Mexico. And almost right off the bat, he declared the requerimiento. And under this requirement, the requerimiento, right? They would read the Nicene Creed of the basic beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. And then they would give them 24 hours to accept the faith and become Roman Catholic. And if not, they would declare holy war on them and fight them. Well, the primary source states that while the gentleman was reading the requerimiento, he himself was killed with a shower of Native American arrows. And another gentleman looked at the other guy and said, I think we have their answer. So that, needless to say, they didn't wait 24 hours and they fought their version of a holy war. You could look also in Arizona at a place called Acoma, and they tried to trade with those in the village of Acoma. And when they didn't, they decided to initiate a punitive expedition to punish them. And they were actually told, don't completely kill them, mortally wound them, and let the priest come through and give them their last rites so that they have a chance of attaining salvation, or at least making it to purgatory. And so you have evidence that you could use if you wanted to put marshal together a neat narrative that adheres to the Black legend, that depicts the Spanish as being religiously fanatical, intolerant, physically brutal, and inequitable. All right. And then in the 1770s, right, with the Sacred Expedition of the 21 famous missions in California. And when you look at some of the evidence of that, some of the quotes there said that it was a coercive institution that, let's see here. Sorry. Right here. A coercive organization, according to Jack Forbes and Cook and Jack Forbes, who came to San Francisco. According to Father Van Kotzebue, he went to the Santa Clara mission and said that they looked like prisoners in dungeons. Father Juan Martin in 1804 said the fathers do nothing but kill Indians. So you could find some awful stuff if you're looking for it. Father Narciso Duran at Mission San Jose supposedly ran it like a sweatshop, exploiting Native American labor. But then in direct contrast to that, you have these hagiographies. And a hagiography is a biography of someone trying to promote that person to be considered a saint in the Catholic Church. And you have Junipero Serra. And according to, accounts with him, right, the Native Americans could be just as treacherous as anybody else and deceitful. that he went through many different deprivations himself and defended the Native Americans against the Spanish soldiers. Because remember, when they would come up and make a mission, then they would make a military fort or presidio, and then they would make a pueblo, a city or town. And then they would have surrounding haciendas, right, with their plantations. And so at any rate, at many occasions, you could find evidence in these hagiographies of Junipero Serra going to great lengths to protect and provide and to treat very fairly and well the Native Americans, including his insistence that they come on their own volition, that they join by choice and are not forced to do so. But nevertheless, and then Luis Jaime was the first, quote, martyr amongst the priests. And according to all accounts, he didn't do anything wrong. He was, matter of fact, went out of his way to protect and take care of them. And they attacked at night, and he was wearing a priestly Spanish robe. And so they killed him. And so, yeah, you have this strange dichotomy of these hagiographies that make heroes of the Spaniards and how well they treated the Native Americans and the deprivation they went through and how idealistic they were and wanting to save their souls, etc. And then you have revisionists revising that history that depicts them as ethnocentric tyrants, right? So to me, the story of someone like Junipero Serra is just fascinating, trying to reconcile those two very different accounts. Any questions or comments? You still with me? Hopefully you're not asleep yet. All right. So at any rate, if I personally had to, if someone came to me and said, Derek, I want you to adhere to the Black Legend, and I want your history to pertain to the United States territory, my first choice would be New Mexico. There's a lot of conflict, a lot of power play, a lot of rebellion, a lot of drama in New Mexico. Look up Pope's Rebellion, spelled like Pope, P-O-P-E. Pope's Rebellion in 1680. There was a priest that was supposedly molesting the young Native American kids, and the Spanish other priests and friars did nothing about it. The Native Americans crucified him in the cathedral. And they virtually killed or chased out of Santa Fe, New Mexico, every Spaniard that September day in 1680. And so, and of course, they would not allow the Native Americans to practice their religion. They had rain dances and other things that were prohibited. And what made matters worse in New Mexico is the Navajo and other Pueblo tribes. They engaged in sexual activities with some of their religious rites, with their fertility rites, literally involved sex. And so the priests, right, they were like, ay, Dios mío, I can't tolerate that. God won't want that. And so they really cracked down on the Navajos' religious liberties and made them behave like good Catholics. And then also what they contend was created was a pigmentocracy. Is if you look at those who were in the highest positions, most of them were Spaniards from Spain. And at one given time, they actually used certificates that said cleanness of blood, limpieza de sangre. I mean, can you believe that? Which is ironic because Spain was so multi-ethnic in its history. You had the early Greeks and the Mycenaeans and other Greeks come into southern Spain so long ago. You had the Romans colonize it. You had the Berbers and the Carthaginians colonize it from North Africa. You had the Muslim Moors colonize it. So as far as cleanness of Spanish blood, I don't know about that. But at any rate, if you could prove that, that you were a pure Spaniard from the peninsula, they could attain to the highest offices. So they were known as peninsulares. Then if you were seen as having two Spanish, pure-blooded Spanish parents, but you were born in the Americas, it was as if you were in a lower echelon, not given the highest titles of being able to be a viceroy or a judge, but you could rise up in the army, you could rise up in the church. Those are the creoles or the criollos, right? And then the vast majority were mestizos, were one parent Native American and the other parent Spanish, which happened so often because some of the Spaniards came without their wives or were not yet married, because they were taking the opportunity to advance by way of the encomienda. Because not only were you given enslaved people, but you were granted minor nobility status known as an hidalgo. So a lot of those Spaniards intermarried or had children with Native American women. And so hence a lot of countries to this day, right, are largely ethnographically mestizo in origin. Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua. All right. And then you have, but to this day, right, you look at places like Costa Rica and Argentina, and there's definitely some historical evidence of government policies and culture and just demographic movement of people being largely more light-skinned in Spanish. And so to a gentleman in the 1970s who ascribed that term pigmentocracy, to him, it's not a coincidence. It's a lever of control. It's a lever of power that's been wielded by the Spanish. And then, of course, Indians and slaves at the bottom. But you see there on the right, there's actually a chart. Right? So see the very first one, a Spaniard with a native in India has a mestizo. A mestizo with a Spaniard has a castizo. And they had an exact chart. Crazy, crazy. And then they had a mercantilist system. They didn't have a free market economy, a capitalist economy. It was mercantilist. But guess what, guys? So did the English. So did the Dutch. Well, the Dutch a little less so, but the English for sure. And the French for sure. And under mercantilism, it's noted, right, that the crown decides that there are finite resources available, and he or she is entitled to the right to determine the allocation of those resources to whom. So you'll find that in number 3. Yes, does someone have something to say? All right. And in California, by the way, if I had to offer write something on people having some wriggle room, right? I would probably say California, as far as they are. I mean, look at this. Here's San Francisco, and here's Mexico City, and that's the viceroy over those of San Francisco. So that's why they called this the frontier up here, because it was so far away and they didn't have good infrastructure for communication and transportation. And so at any rate, up in California, especially pueblos like San Jose, they at times chased the hated corregidores out of town, made their own decisions for their local leaders, and even some of their own local laws. In Los Angeles, you had a very ethnically diverse city council, which included a, quote, the Spanish called it a mulatto, but that's not the proper term anymore, black and white mixture, biracial, and some mestizos, etc. Served on the city council of Los Angeles very early on in its history. So at any rate, but going back to the assignment, Are there any questions as to any of these numbers, as to what you ought to be looking for? I like to think that I gave very heavy hints as far as what to look for in each or any of these numbers. Okay, well, let me make sure, let me take a look at these names and make sure that I have everyone's name. Hmm. I believe I do.
I'm sorry, Professor, just a quick question.
Sure.
Are you posting this Zoom on the modules?
Yes, I will be.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just a little bit late because I had to work and I came in like in the middle. So I
No,
missed.
no problem. I understand, especially with work. I completely respect that and understand.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
No problem. All right. So yeah, I'll have this up. It usually takes about an hour to download. And then sometimes shortly after that, I should be able to post it. All right. And yeah. If there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'm done. Unless you have some specific questions, I'd be happy to address. So I hope you guys are doing fine. I'll try to get on correcting so you'll know that we're on the same page as far as what I'm expecting on these assignments. And I appreciate you hanging in there with me throughout this this hour-long lecture. Thank you. I appreciate your appreciation. All right, happy to do this every week. All right, so the rest of you have a good day, okay? If you have any questions or comments, message me by way of Canvas message. And I've also given you both my phone numbers online. In a case of an emergency, I'd prefer the Canvas message if that's okay. All right, but you guys have a great week and good luck with all this.